Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 194. I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast today by Josh Rice. Josh, how are we doing?
Yeah, all good. Thanks. Yourself?
I'm good, thanks, mate. It's good to have you on. Thank you for freeing up some time for me.
No, not at all. Really looking forward to it.
Good man, good man. Well, let's jump straight in, mate, because I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I know we've got some cool stuff to cover. Let's go into you. Like we always do, we go into the background to start with. So can you give us a little bit of background on yourself? And I've not mentioned your role or the club you're at yet. So do you want to take us into that as well?
Yeah, so I guess starting from the very start, a very average football player, but really loved it. So when I was 18, I made the decision to go up to John Moores Uni to do the sports science degree, but with the focus on the science in football. So did that for 3 years, and in my final year was lucky enough to get the placement internship at Everton. It was a blend across the academy and first team. So I worked with Matt Taberner, Jason O'Keefe, and Dave Flower in the first team, and then people like Jack Dowling and John McKeown in the academy. So I had a good experience of that. From there, I went on to work at Liverpool for 3 years doing the PhD studentship under guidance of combination of obviously Jack Aid at the club for the applied stuff, and then Barry Drust at the University initially of John Moores, and then we transferred to University of Birmingham when he moved in my final year. So I did my PhD fully applied at the club with help from James Malone, Tom Brownlee, and Alistair McRobert, and that was a really good process for me that I think not only let me gain a good insight of working within the applied environment, but also how to blend that research into practice. So I was always, I like to think I was always hoping to, if I read something, to bring it to the table to Jack and the other people within the department and say, could we implement this, or is this a good idea? Rather than it just being what's always gone on within the club and within the sports science practice. So hopefully I was a useful part along with the other PhD students to kind of bring up-to-date research and blend it into the club. And then now, so I actually work at Tottenham Hotspur within the academy under Matt Allen as the academy reconditioning coach. So my main roles in terms of delivery are with the 18s and 23s, the end stage rehab, but I'll get involved from pretty much, not day one, but pretty much the first week in terms of some sort of gym work or fitness work with the players. And then I also oversee the reconditioning process for the younger age group. So what the content is in liaising with the coaches of when they're ready to go back in. But the delivery on the younger age groups, as you can imagine, with scheduling and with demands is a lot more minimal. So that's probably a whistle stop tour of it. And yeah, that's kind of me at the minute.
Brilliant, mate. Now, there's a long list, and you've named a lot of people there, people that have come through the whole internship at Everton and even onto the role at Liverpool as well. Yeah. There's a lot of successes that happen from those routes, obviously individually, but also together, isn't there? What makes those stand out for you, Josh? Because starting with the Everton, I've spoke to a lot of people like Dave Flower and a number of others as well, the difference on that internship process, because a lot of people end up in good roles after it, don't they?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's because obviously Everton's a massive club, and I think it's that firstly just developing you as a person is as in having so much exposure to players and just talking to them as people. I think you can learn as much as you want out of a textbook and deliver on courses or have to submit essays, and you might, I'm sure that there was loads of people on the course that were a lot smarter than what I was, but I'd like to think that the interaction with the players and just being able to talk to them and understand how to deliver the knowledge that I do know then meant that I was in a better position to get a job after, if that makes sense. And especially at Liverpool with that PhD, obviously the demands that Barry placed on me in terms of the level of understanding I needed for the PhD, and the way that we actually went about the PhD, where all four of my studies were, so one was a systematic review, one was a quantitative piece, one was a qualitative piece, and then the other one was kind of a commentary article. It was a blend, not only of doing a PhD, but techniques within the sports science world of how to write different papers. So an understanding of all of it, I think then gives you a good process of being able to then get a job in the real world after.
Yeah, yeah, that experience is key, isn't it? And obviously, drawing from some of those people that you've talked about as well, and their experiences in the game is crucial too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, the other thing, Josh, I know you spoke about this relatively recently as well, is that role of a research practitioner within football. What are your views on that, and where do you see that fitting?
Yeah, so I think it's not necessarily like a role as such. I would probably say it's just more of like how you act or how you are as a practitioner. So for me, like even there's someone I work with here called Adrian. He's very much he doesn't have the like PhD, but he's very much like he looks at what the up to date research is, whether that be from cycling, whether that be from swimming, but the principles behind it, and thinks, okay, how can we deliver that into our program? So what bits can we take this useful and what bits aren't? So rather than it just being conversations with the coaches or with other sports scientists within the club of this is what we've always done, it's worked, and it's like that's all well and good, and there definitely needs to be a place for that. But actually, if we want to take it to the next level, how can we use the up-to-date research, not from textbooks, but from literally like recently published articles, whether that be in football or not, like I've mentioned, and then implement it into our work. So, for instance, a block of running that we're doing, okay, we're doing 15 on, 15 off like the way that people used to have done it, or it's commonly known as we'll do a 15 on 15 off box to box. But actually, can we implement a 1500-meter time trial or a 5-minute distance trial and then prescribe it individually? So we might have 10 different groups where it's 15 on 15 off, but one's going 83 meters and the other one's going 75. So the 83 meters and the 75 are both working to their own specific capabilities. So rather than it just being generic, those little marginal gains over a course of a season, you'd like to think, and especially in a developmental program like what we have in the academy, is beneficial. That's kind of like a brief example of why I think it's important.
And then just on the back of that, you've said about looking at other sports. Is there anything else that sort of jumps out for you or other peers that you've taken from specifically from other sports?
I think the main thing for me, without naming like research, is just the running side of things. So when obviously the physios take players at the start of a rehab process, or then when they transition to me, it's like, well, they might say, oh, we're doing 6 times 2-minute runs. How can we make those 6 times 2-minute runs as beneficial as possible? So rather than it just being, can they run? It's like, okay, can they run but get some sort of aerobic fitness benefit from them? So a target distance. So based, like what I just said, off that distance trial, he might be running, say, 500 meters in that time, rather than it just being, he's just doing 2 minutes self-paced. So from day one, you're actually, by how much, I'm not sure, but you'd like to think you're speeding up the process of them reintegrating, because the fitness gains are quicker than if they were just doing things that were like relevant to them.
If we tap into the psychology of a player as well, that's going to be more beneficial anyway, isn't it? If you've got a specific target that they're trying to hit in that process, and I know we're going to touch on the rehab process, but that's surely going to be more beneficial for them as well, isn't it? Having that target set in place.
Yeah, I think there's probably like sometimes a bit of a stigma around players that they don't, or they like to get the easy way out. But I think if you actually speak to players about, and you have like a real good knowledge base about what you're trying to deliver them, and go like, look, if we do this, you're coming back 2 weeks earlier. And whether that actually is the case or not, you're trying to get them back 2 weeks earlier, right? From say a 6-month injury. So if for every bike session, like what bike session or CV session, they've got a target, and they know that if they hit that target, they're inching closer to getting back. I think, like you said, that mindset shift of, okay, well, I'm going to do this because it's going to have more benefit than if I kind of, for want of a better term, just toss it off. Then I think, yeah, from day one, just having some sort of actual scientific input with like evidence behind it, the players buy into it straight away, because they know also, even if even if you might not know, you come across like you really know what you're on about as well. And I think the players just buy into your process straight away.
Yeah, because we've said this a lot on the podcast, but we're dealing with competitive animals, aren't we? Like whether we have the perception that players do toss off a rehab or whatever, but if you make it competitive like that, and even competitive with themselves, you're going to draw something out of them, aren't you? Especially when they're not playing.
Yeah. So like I've obviously mentioned prior to you, at the club now we have like a few different fitness tests we do. there's three predominant ones. We do a max GACON 3 times a season. We do a 1500 meters. I'd say more like after a block of training. So you're looking, say, 6 to 8 weeks, depending on obviously schedules. And then we do like a weekly or bi-weekly submax yo-yo. And for example of what you've just said, throughout the off season, I've had players text me, and I'm sure Matt and a couple of other people the same. They've asked me, what's the app and how do I download the submax yo-yo? And they've said, what's a good 1500 meter time trial? And it's like, they're not asking for like specific runs as such because they got their program, but they want to know, because they know that they don't have to come back and do it, that's the process is in place, and they want to know that they're still competitive. So they're already talking our language without even realizing it.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I'm glad this podcast comes when it does, because it's off the back of speaking to Paulie last week at Arsenal. And we spoke a lot about managing individuals' progression throughout the academy system. And he went into some specific stories about Saka and Smith Rowe and a number of other players as well. But I thought it'd be great to sort of piggyback on that, but look more at the rehab side, because I know that's what you deal with. So thinking with that in case, and we have sort of spoke about it a little bit there already, but when we're managing individuals, especially in the rehab process, what are some of your thought pathways in terms of making the most of that opportunity with them?
Yeah, the first thing I'd say is, well, there's two things that I'd say that I'd go for straight away, is automatically talking to the player and knowing them as a person. So I've had a player now for 6 months. Sometimes I spend 4 to 6 hours a day with him. If I can't talk to him about what his missus is doing at the weekend or what he likes for dinner, then that's a long 6 hours. So knowing them as a person, first of all, so that those conversations, and then suddenly the gym session doesn't become a boring gym session. It's actually, we're changing the music, we're doing this, doing that. And it becomes like, he's almost like he's not your mate, because you need to know that you're above him and you got your authority. But it's definitely a lot easier to implement your work if they respect you as a person and you get on with them as a human being. So that's the first thing. But then at the same time, within that first week, probably tell them it's going to be a love-hate relationship. So you're going to hate me the whole way through this rehab process, but hopefully 4 weeks back, you're in training, yourself and the manager's like, actually, like, thanks for that. Like, I've come back flying, I'm ready to play. The other thing in terms of like the rehab process is, the way that I kind of work with the coach here is, or the coaches here is, I say, I'd like to think that by the end of the rehab, that they're available for specific or a significant amount of minutes when they come back. So they're not just ready to train, they're also like ready to play. That is because the way that like our model works is quite fluid with the coaches. So if I've kind of like to think I've built a relationship with the coaches, that if my player that I've got in rehab is ready to be within a warm-up or a technical drill, but I still know that he's not going to be able to do contact for another 4 weeks, then he'll do the warm-up in the technical drill, and then he'll do his top-ups and his specific work with me after. So the coach kind of like, although he's not back fully, he's kind of almost with him, giving him coaching time a month before he's actually physically or fully fit, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then when the time comes to play, then he's like, okay, yeah, this week he gets 45 or 60 minutes, but actually he's not rusty on the ball because he's been with the team for X amount of time. And I would say I'm a physical coach and I've been doing my UEFA B, but I'm not as good as these coaches that are working here. So it's like, well, let them do their expertise and make sure that they know that when you're doing yours, it's for the right reasons as well. I don't know if I've really answered that much of that question, but it's an attempt.
No, you definitely have. And it was something that we were going to talk about, is that relationship. And it's something we touched on a lot, and we're going to continue to talk about it because of the fact it is so important, isn't it? And you've just mentioned there, in that rehab process, again, taking it back to the player, the fact that they can be involved so early in that process, albeit not fully training at that stage, is so important, isn't it? Even just for the psychology of that rehab stage or phase.
100%. And it's even the little like nuances around planning the day of, so if the team prep is at 11:30 and then they're training at 12:30, well, your team, you're going to do your prep at the same time as the team. You might have your specific program, what you can get involved in with the team you can do, but then you're going to have your own bits, obviously like specific to the injury, but then so are all the players that are in training anyway, because we do like our generic stuff, but then they'll have their own individual like player programs that they need to work on based off past injury history, or if they need to do extra, I don't know, say extra core work because we've seen on a core capacity test they're not good. So it's like, it's managing that whole day really, and that whole thing, so that they don't feel isolated. So there's like not a rehab program and a team program. They're doing a rehab training session, but they're still part of the team, if that makes sense. They walk out with their teammates onto the pitch. Obviously this can't happen every day, but as much as possible, they walk out with their teammates on the pitch. They do similar themes on pitch as what the team have, so they feel the same after. Then they're doing their lower body session at the same time as the team, even though there might be like an hour and the team are just doing a maintenance session of half hour. It's just where possible, making them feel part of the group, so they're not like an isolated figure for like 6 months, for example. The same with like team meetings. Well, he hasn't been involved against Man United this weekend, but go in and like have that meeting with the team, and we'll do your rehab after. It's just making sure that they feel part of the team, even when they're actually injured.
Because rehab's a hard position to be in anyway, isn't it? But when they are segregated, like you said, and you come out of the change rooms and they go left and all the teammates go right, that's a really hard position to be in, isn't it? So as much as, like you say, you need to do the work, the rehab's got to get done. But these little things, I think, are really crucial, aren't they, to keep the player on track?
Yeah, I think so. And obviously, the days of the player's day in rehab is normally a lot longer than the team as well. So if they're then like, okay, I come in at 9 o'clock, the team come in at 9:30, the team have left by 3, but I'm still working at 4:30. At least if that period of time of 7 hours, they've been working with the team, then that 90 minutes at the end, it's not going to feel as bad. The other thing I think that we've done quite well in terms of like we were saying, in terms of the coaches and blending the research into practice, is we do similar things within rehab, similar principles, get the ball out as early as we can as what the team do. So I'll try and marry up when the team do like a sub-max yo-yo on the pitch, for example, or when the team are doing their intensive session, so that I can speak to the coaches in the morning and be like, well, what type of drills are you doing? And then if, like, for instance, there's certain things in the warm-up that he's doing, then I can try and do similar things so the player doesn't feel left out. So I think it's just about having quite like a good multidisciplinary team as well, though, because I think we did, especially in the 23s where I predominantly work here, I think that is really like good with our like daily morning meetings. We have them sports science, but then also with the physios, and then we also have them with like the whole team, and then we'll have a monthly meeting and just talk about how the players are getting on. So there's always a lot of touch points, so everyone knows where they're at, and the players also know that everyone cares because they see them on a regular basis.
I want to just dive into the relationship building, but with two people basically. So first of all, with the player, because I know you've touched on it a little bit before, spending so much time with the player, knowing a lot about them. But is there any sort of specifics so when a player gets injured and then they end up coming to see you, are there any sort of strategies that you take, or is it case by case with each player?
Obviously, some are easier than others. I'd say the beauty of how I've kind of just mentioned how we work is that although I'm the reconditioning coach, I'm always around the team because of how we structure the kind of like the days. So I'll still deliver prep for the team and be in gym sessions for the team, but also take the rehab within it. So it's not like I'm just isolating myself either. So I get on with all the players. They see me every day. They don't just see me as like the reconditioning guy who's like the bad guy when you get injured, you don't want to go there. They actually will see me as the performance coach as well. So I think because I haven't pigeonholed myself, or Matt hasn't pigeonholed me into that position, that allows for that instant relationship. It's like, well, not hi, nice to meet you, we haven't spoken for 6 months. It's like, I see you every day. This is just a different way of working now. What was the second part of the question? Sorry.
So the second bit was going to be about the coach, because we've just mentioned before about getting him integrated back into training.
Yeah.
But there'll be a lot of people listening that be like, well, that maybe their coach isn't quite as flexible with their approach or whatever it is. But how would you go about building that relationship from day one?
Yeah. So from day one, when I came into the club, I had a pars fracture that was passed over to me and a 3C hamstring. So the first thing was like, I need to nail these two and make sure that they come back flying, because that's an instant win. So that was really key, and making sure that they didn't get re-injured, which thankfully that they were good. I think once you start bringing players back and then I'd say, I know Jason's spoke a bit about this before as well. If you bring a player back from injury and you see it as an opportunity to get better, and they come back fitter, and then they go in and then they're like top of the list within training, and just on the eye they look really good, then instantly the coach is like, you don't even really need to have a conversation with them. It's just they have your respect straight away. But in terms of creating that buy-in, it's more like what I was talking about earlier, where when you can have, or have's the wrong word because that sounds like I own the player, but when you can pass a player into specifics of the coaching session, it's like, for me, it's a no-brainer to give them to the coaches. But then it's like, when they're actually not able to do that part of training, and they come out and they're working to the side of the pitch, but they can see them working really hard, or every time just the coaches are walking by and they see, oh wow, like they're working at this level, so they're obviously working hard even though they're not in training, then they know that it's the right time for them to be with me. But then they also trust the judgment that when it's the right time to be with the coaches, that I'm like, because I've given them to do certain bits, they know when I say kind of like, nah, he's not actually ready to be in full training, they respect that decision, if that makes sense. Another thing that I forgot to touch on as well, that I don't know whether it's the same at every club, and I'm not sure whether it's the right or wrong way to do, but something that I personally do here is I pretty much do all of the sessions with the players. So all of the coaches kind of like, so when we do fitness testing out on the pitch, like I'll run with the players, and like with all the running, I'll run with them. When they're on the watt bike, I'll do that, which is nice because I get to eat quite a lot of food around that. And even sometimes, never like lower body gym sessions, but if there's only a couple players, we might join in and do like upper body sessions with them. And I think that creates like a culture of, as well, of like, well, if you're willing to do it and you're willing to put yourself through that, then we also know that it's like, well, we've got to do it as well. Because if the coach can do it and he's older than us, like, come on, we should be beating him. So I think all of it, like the coach is just walking by and seeing me sweating as much as what the players are, they know that I'm making it tough for both of us. So I think just the culmination of everything is how I've gone about it, really.
I think with that, with both of those points you just made, it's mutual respect, isn't it? Because when you're training alongside the player, there's a respect there that you're sort of going through it at the same time. But also what you touched on before about the coach, about having that flexibility to say, right, you can have them for this part of the session, but then I need to have them back for that part. That's the mutual respect as well, isn't it? Because you're both winning in that environment, aren't you?
100%. Yeah, no, definitely. I think that is the key, really. I think the coaches here, especially, I've not experienced it a lot. I know at Liverpool as well, Paul Squires and Ollie Morgan, who did pretty much an identical role at Liverpool as what I do here. They did the same, and I think, well, Squires, he was, and Ollie, to be fair, they were both like really fit, so they're running in front of the players. And I think that's obviously a key thing as well. Like, you can't be joining in with the session and running 50 meters behind them. But like, if you're joining in and you're showing that you're working hard, and even in the football sessions, like I'll do 1v1s with the players, and you show that there's like a respect of, okay, he can actually play football, he can run, and he can do a little bit of everything. I think that helps their I think that helps the respect of the coaches, and knows that what you're doing is not just old school rubbish work. You're actually trying to make them better as not only like athletes, but actually as players as well.
And just looking at that whole sort of protocol in terms of the return to play, one thing we haven't touched on as much, I know you've mentioned a little bit in terms of the monitoring you're doing, but when you're seeing that with your coaching eye that a player is potentially not quite ready, they're not at the point that you want them to be, you know there's some extra work needed to go in, the monitoring that you've done previously, I know that will then come to the forefront because we're trying to get them to the same level, if not better level than before. So what's your approach to that? And also, how does that tie in with the coach then as well? Yeah.
So I think the benefit of having all of our testing is that we have like, well, I'd say exit numbers or re-entry numbers, whatever you want to call it, really, for how fit that player was and how he was in comparison to the team. So it's not just, okay, well, I know he's back at this level and he's good to go. It's actually, he's better than before, or no, he's not as good before. So if you want to take this player back in training now, you have to understand that he isn't as fit as he was, so he's going to require some extra work around it. But also he might be functionally fine to go into training. So it's also getting that blend. In terms of like the monitoring, it's obviously we have loads of data, and sure every club's the same. You see what their normal week is. You see, well, the thing is within obviously rehab is that the numbers probably don't tell the full story, because if you do like an individual session, I'm sure if you've done them in the past, just working one-on-one with a coach is normally a little bit more demanding in a team setting, just because of the intensity. So the numbers don't necessarily, for me, in volume, always need to be the 35k weeks, but the intensity and the meters per minute of each metrics and the demands of the actual actions that are undetectable by GPS need to make sure that you've got those. So little things, just like not just okay, in this week we've done 800 meters of high speed and that's his average, but if he's only done that over 4 efforts of 200 meters because he's done like a lot of high speed running, or 200 meters is probably a bad example, but say he's done 8 efforts of 100 meters high speed, but in a week he does it over like 30 efforts. It's like, well, have we actually really ticked that off? Because for me, that's a different load, like physiologically, than doing 30 short, sharp, high speed efforts than just doing 800 meters.
Yeah.
So I guess it's just understanding what the player did prior to getting injury, reverse engineering it, trying to get as close or if better than he can, and then putting them back into training. So, and then like you said, if they're not based on testing, then it might be, okay, well, look, you wanted to be in training, but we haven't worked hard enough. So this afternoon we'll go to the pool and do a CV, or we'll do an upper body CV work to try and improve that. You can only get them as close as possible, but you'd like to think that those little small wins the players buy into, because there's actual data to be like, well, you're not at that level, so you won't be as good as you think you are when you go back into training. And the coach is the same. They know that they won't be, because the data is there to show.
And how are you prioritizing that? Because you just mentioned before that the amount of data that you'll be collecting, and I'm sure there's a lot of clubs that are in the same position. You end up with so much data. Like, how are you then picking out the important parts to prioritize?
I think the same, reverse engineering it. So what is the month that they're about to go into probably is a big thing to look at. If it's double game weeks and you've got your A grade player, I know you shouldn't really say that there's A or B grade players, but everyone knows that that's the thing.
Yeah.
And you've got an A grade player, you know that the manager's probably going to go, oh, you can play 45, but that 45 turns into 60 or 90. Well, maybe you kind of sell it as, actually, he's a little bit more time with me because look at the demands of what he's going to go into. So that would be a combination of what GPS his numbers are. At the end of rehab, I try and do something which I got off of the principle off of Ollie Morgan, like a match simulation. So look at their data in like an acute bout of a game. Won't go after the volume of like 10 to 12K. It might end up being like 7 to 8, but they might do within a game. It's normally ball and play time somewhere between 50 to 55 minutes. So they'll do like 2 25 or 27-minute halves of their specific actions to their game. And then they'll just work, and we just call it like a match simulation. So it's like the intensity of a game you'd like to think you've replicated. So then you could be confident, well, he's probably ready to play a significant amount of the game in terms of a data point. And then on top of that, his physical testing, not just like his on-pitch testing, but his off-pitch. So obviously you want to get the players as symmetrical as possible. If they've had certain lower limb injuries, as strong as possible. Okay, he's actually ready to go. So it's a combination of everything. I don't think you'd ever pigeonhole it just to he's fit enough to go, but he's fit enough, but he's got a 10 centimeter deficit in his like counter movement jumps, his single leg counter movement jumps. It's like, well, he's not ready to go, is he?
Yeah. Yeah, it's all about the big picture at that point, isn't it? Yeah. And that's where, again, we go back to like the relationships and discussions, and I'm going to talk about language and stuff in a second, but that's where that's so important, isn't it? Because if they're not in play, everyone's looking at individual aspects of it rather than the big picture, like you just touched on.
Yeah, 100%.
So in terms of that, the language is key, isn't it? When we're communicating with coaches, you talked about it before we started recording, which I thought was really, really key. But when you're communicating with coaches throughout that process, when it is at a time when maybe they're tempted to go, no, we'll get the player back and we'll do more minutes or whatever it's going to be, that's then crucial for you to be communicating effectively, isn't it, at that point?
Yeah. So I think a thing that me and Matt have spoken a lot about is trying to rule out the subjectivity of decision making as much as possible. And from that, that's why we do quite a lot of testing at Tottenham. But I think in terms of our injury history, especially within the 23s over the last couple of years, like our availability has been really good. And I think it's because we've hopefully been able to make like good decisions based upon data rather than just, okay, he looks fit, he's good to go. So for us, it was like we were saying about recently implementing those physical testing. We've tried to change the mindset of the coaches, I think, without them really knowing, if that's the right way to say, of how, rather than them asking how fit they are and you just saying, yeah, he looks fit, it's they're asking the specifics, like how good is 1500 meter time trial? How good is sub max? And because we've spoke to the coaches and delivered the data in a way where they understand it, they're able to look at it and go, oh, well, he's not ready. Like, so why are we even having this conversation? So then those tough conversations where it's just like, oh, but he looks good, it doesn't even really become a thing, because there's actually everyone's on the same page in terms of they're speaking our language without even really realizing it, if that makes sense to some degree. And the same in terms of the way we deliver physical feedback at the games. We won't always like, we look at team totals as well as individuals. So how did we work as a team, not just as, okay, he done, like, so what is the effectiveness of his work, for example? So we've got one or two players that just run a lot and do a lot of high speed, but sometimes they're not that effective. So put into a team context, like we might have all this data, but we might not win the game. So it's like, well, actually, is it based upon those individuals who, although they're running a lot, we're not doing a lot with the ball? So it's just about gradually over time building relationships to understand what the coaches want to see, what you want them to see of what you're working, and then kind of finding that mutual ground. So the discussions are very much like, not in a scientific language whatsoever, but there's like some underpinning of like, yeah, sports science really as well.
It's the education of sports science and what you're trying to achieve, I suppose, isn't it? Because those subjective questions on how fit is he, or we always talk about them not moving well and all that sort of stuff. It's like probably everyone has different perceptions depending on what role they're in and what they actually mean, don't they? Whereas you're ruling that out with this, because we're saying like, this is the specifics of what we're looking at.
Yeah, hopefully. And I think as well, there's still definitely a place for coaches to, we've definitely had coaches where we've been running players in a straight line going, oh, he's not moving very well. But there's also like a rationale that he's good enough to run in a straight line. We'll have a discussion when we're inside and be like, I know he doesn't look good and we would never think about him turning around on the pitch, but he can run in a straight line and get fit in a straight line, and progressively over time we're working on this, but he's at a position to do this specific work. So those conversations still do happen, but I think because they know that we've got data behind it, that they know that we're kind of putting good decisions in place rather than it just being, yeah, we think he's good to go. So that's how I think it's worked here, to be honest.
Yeah, there's obviously a good understanding there, isn't there? And again, I think it's the respect in the relationship, isn't it? That's what it's coming back to.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not an easy thing to build. And obviously there's times when we have had players that get re-injured and it does get frosty, but they know that you have got the good intentions of the player. And I think at the 23s here, we treat it close to like a first team environment as well, to some degree, where the demands of putting players back into training and being ready for a game are close to that of a first team. I know it's not as demanding because they're not worth 80 million pounds, and like some of the names that you mentioned that Powdy was mentioning, like they're not the players that we're working with right now. But there's still a demand that, well, he's missing vital time to become a professional footballer with the first team. So no, he needs to play against Chelsea at the weekend.
Brilliant. Josh, have you got any sort of final thoughts of wrapping that up, or do you feel like we've covered everything that we said?
I feel like, yeah, from what we mentioned before, I think we're pretty close to it. Yeah.
Perfect,
if you're happy
mate.
with that.
Yeah, awesome. I was just going to move on to some of the quick fires that we finished the podcast with, which I know I've not told you about, so I'm dropping this on you.
Yeah.
But you've mentioned a number of names there, and I think that alone, it highlights the importance of having good people around you.
Yeah.
But also, is there anyone, including those people obviously that you've already mentioned,
Yeah.
who have been some of the most or the biggest influences on your career so far?
I think I'll go at this in two ways. I think there was a couple of seasons when I was at Liverpool, when in our office we had Jack Aid, Ollie Morgan, we had Jordan Milsom, we had, I know this is like name dropping sports science practitioner, Tom Maynard. Who else did we have? And then obviously we had like Tom King, Dave Robshaw, and people like that who have all gone on, like, and Adam Rowan, who's now at Man City. We were all within the same department at that time. And obviously as a young practitioner, I'm not saying I haven't worked in other good departments like what I'm working in now, but at that time of my journey, I think that was my first year at Liverpool, the conversations that I were listening to were way in advance of what I've heard on the, like, in terms of specific to football, were way in advance of what I'd heard on my course. So that was vital for that year of learning for myself as just a combination of the group. In terms of like the biggest person influence, I'd probably have to say, because of the opportunity that he gave me, and he still almost acts as like a mentor, like Barry Just has really helped me on a personal level as well, because there's been tough times like living away from home, like personal relationships and stuff like that. But also is just making me think about things in a scientific way, but blending them into that applied setting. I don't think there's anyone better than at that than Barry. Like the conversations, the way that you ask him a question, the way that he responds makes you think about, why did I even ask that question? That's not relevant, if you know what I mean. So as one individual, I'd say because of how long I've worked with him from the start of my degree in 18 to all the way now when I'm 26, still working and like still in contact with him over everything, I'd say he's probably like a really big influence so far. Yeah.
Brilliant. What would you say your biggest strength is as a practitioner?
My biggest strength, I'd say, I'd like to think that building the relationships, the work that I'm delivering to the players, is done as good as possible, is my biggest strength. Like this summer, I went away abroad with a few players that I'd worked with like prior, and got invited to train them on holiday. And I think that like those opportunities come about from building good relationships, and doing like, those are the rewards that I like to think are, because not only am I hopefully delivering a good work over there, but the other 22 hours a day when we're not training, they're happy to just talk to me as a human being. But then putting that back into what I'm doing at the club, I'd like to think that that's also replicated, so that just the delivery of the sports science becomes easy, because you're doing a bench press, but you're talking to them after about something else. It just makes that session a lot easier.
Yeah,
but there's
100%.
also on that, I think that there's definitely a fine line between becoming a mate of theirs and still delivering. So I think that's the key as well, like building a relationship, but also getting that balance of knowing that you'll have that authority. So yeah, that's probably, I'd like to think, my biggest strength.
They've got to know that the work's still got to get done, haven't it?
Yeah.
And that's the important thing, that you can't be just falling into just the mate, can you?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, brilliant. Josh, I'm taking you back now. Pre-Everton, pre-internship, like what would you, if you think of yourself back then, what would be your biggest advice to Josh back then?
My biggest advice
in terms of career advice?
I think it would be, so when I went to uni, I did focus a lot on having fun, but also on the work side of things as well. I was fortunate in terms of my family that I did some part-time work, but I wasn't like really needing to do that part-time work. But I would go out and seek opportunities to coach a little bit here and there. I was involved within the football team. I was just trying to immerse myself as much as possible. And I think that helped in terms of when I went in, then I was able to, I know it's not really right that you say you can play football, but even in my interview with Matt, it was like part of it he said was, when I went out and delivered on the pitch, it was, can you just kick a ball? So I think being able to kind of have all that sports science knowledge, but then just understand football as a football practitioner is really key. And just like even little things, like sometimes you go out onto the pitch and then you're told you get this size area, you go out and the goalkeepers are working here. So suddenly I've got a 20 by 20 grid and I haven't planned for that. The fact that I've watched football for so long and think about different movements and stuff, you can just think on the spot, and the player almost doesn't realize that this isn't the session you've planned, but you're also delivering in a good way. So just, if you see as much stuff as you can when you're younger, then when you come to working within the field, then you kind of can just think on your feet, I think.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because we've spoke about that before, where you get, I don't know whether this is harsh to call them, non-football people coming into football. I think there are benefits to that. But then at the same time, if you think about going into a sport that you know nothing about, you don't have all that background behind you, do you? And the experience of just watching games, playing as a kid, or even like playing games as a young lad or whatever, to be able to adapt like that. And it's quite an interesting thought process, isn't it, behind non-football people and football people?
Yeah, I think it's definitely tough, but it's the same, I guess, with coaches, that a lot of coaches are ex-players. It's a lot of like, you go in and you're judged. Like, I remember my first day here, like, a couple of coaches, we just out on the pitch waiting to warm up, and they just start wrapping balls into you, and that they're just like playing around with you, whatever, but you know that they're judging you as well slightly. And then they're going to go back into all the coaches and go, "Oh, he's wearing like Adidas trampolines out there." So it's like, you know that you have to have a little bit, otherwise you can get found out, rightly or wrongly, just because that's the nature of the beast, I guess.
Yeah, but that first touch, it stuck, didn't it? Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I'm still here at the minute, so hopefully.
Josh, last one. What is your approach to CPD, continual education? I know you've done loads of great research so far. I'm sure there's probably a bit more to come as well. Like, what's your approach to that?
So for me, I think building the CV was the initial thing. So I think obviously I've got my final UK SCA exam in September. I'm also close to completing the bases and the UEFA B. And then obviously, like with the PhD, I've tried to build my CV up as much as possible. So then anything after that is like CPD of what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
The thing for me with CPD would be obviously reading, which I won't lie, since finishing the PhD, I kind of did take a little bit of a break. But then just going out and probably doing CPD events that are nothing like what you've ever looked at, really. So going and doing like a physio event on the Achilles, because if you can understand and talk to the physio about the Achilles and understand why they're doing that, maybe that would influence your strength programs. And then the other thing as well is, similar to this podcast, I've never done one before, but just saying yes. And I've been asked to speak at the bases event in the King Power, which I've never presented before, and that's in November. So I'm going to be nervous about that, and probably shouldn't wear like a grey or blue shirt. But just things like that, just immerse yourself, because it's only going to kind of like develop you, I guess, as a person. And if you flop, then it is what it is, isn't it?
No, mate. So that's a great bit of advice for people, isn't it? Because essentially that's getting out of the comfort zone. It's testing yourself as a practitioner, isn't it? Because you're having to deliver. And I think as nervy and as anxiety filled as some of those things are, it always comes out and works better, doesn't it, long term? Because you learn lessons along the way.
I think so. Even like even with the PhD, you'd ask like people that knew me at the time when you're taking it on. Like, I was always interested in working in sports science and being a coach or whatever. But the PhD, like, I was never unbelievable at like English. Like Barry will tell you, he didn't expect me to be the person from sports science to the degree that I was on to go in kind of like do what I'm doing, because I did like playing football at the team and I was with the football crowd kind of thing. But just immersing on that and being like, okay, yeah, I can write 300 words. Not a lot of people are going to read it, so it should be okay. It's just, yeah, immersing yourself in whatever you can, because eventually when it's done, it will benefit you.
Brilliant, mate. Well, this has been class, Josh. Thank you for doing it. Thank you for coming on. Just wrap us up, mate. Just give people the place they can go to sort of get in touch or keep an eye on what you've got going on.
Yeah, so to be honest with you, I'm not really that active on social media at all, but my Twitter, I believe it's Josh Rice 8 or Josh Rice 95. That's how active I am on it. I think it's Josh Rice
it's 95. I think you're 95.
So yeah, that shows you how active I am on it. Maybe I need to start, but that's the main one really, or LinkedIn, obviously, just Josh Rice. So yeah.
Perfect, mate. Well, thank you very much for doing it. I really appreciate it. I think we covered some really good stuff there, and you gave some really good insights as well. So thank you very much.
No, cheers, Ben. Thanks for having me on. Been really good.